Welcome everyone to the BMRC's, I think this is probably our fourth or fifth talk in our Research Fellows presentations for the fall. We have, my name is Sumaya Ahmed. I'm the Executive Director of the BMRC. And if you will bear with me, I do have some slides to share. So today we've been joined by Dr. Martha Peter Patterson, Professor of English at McKendree University. Dr. Patterson is the co-editor with Henry Louis Gates Jr. of The New Negro, A History of Documents, 1887 to 1937. That is forthcoming, I believe. It's at the presses, will be out soon. If I'm,
It's actually already out.
it's already out. Okay, great.
Yes.
And also the author of the Harlem Renaissance Weekly, Reading the New Negro Movement in 1920s Black Newspapers. Is that one already out as well, Martha?
No, that one is forthcoming. That one
Okay,
should be
that's one.
this month.
Okay, that's
That
one.
one should be this month.
Okay, wow. And you're also editing the Cambridge Companion to Fiction of the Harlem Renaissance. Wow.
Yeah.
I wonder how much sleep you get on it. We can talk about that later. Joining us as a discussant is Dr. E. James West, lecturer in Interdisciplinary Societies and Cultures, Arts and Sciences at University College London. Dr. West's research focuses primarily on the Black press and African American urban history. He is interested in race, rights, and media across the Black diaspora. He is the author of 4 books, including A House for the Struggle, 2022, as well as Ebony Magazine and Lerone, Bennett Jr., and Our Kind of Historian and Media Building. And his commentary appears in major outlets such as the New York Times, BBC, Times, Slate, NPR, and the Washington Post. We should also add that Dr. James West has also been a BMRC Fellow multiple times, and we've really benefited from his research, and we're glad to have been able to support him as well as Dr. Patterson. So before we begin with the discussion of the research, would like to just, for the people who are maybe new to the BMRC, explain the work of the BMRC. Next year, the BMRC will turn 20 years old. We are a consortium of currently 28 archives, libraries, and museums across the Chicago metropolitan area, and we strive to cultivate a network and steward a network of all who seek to document, share, understand, and preserve Black experiences in the Chicago metropolitan area. You can see here our current 28 members. Most recent addition has been the Haitian American Museum of Chicago and the Honey Pot Performance, the Black Social Cultural Map. So we are focusing on African American as well as other African diaspora communities and their histories in Chicago. We have since 2009 been able to support summer research fellowships, and so this year you see the picture here of the scholars we were able to support this year, and many of them have already given their fellows talks, and those will be found on our YouTube page. If they're if they're not there now, they should be there within the next few days, and then as we complete these talks, they are added to our YouTube page, so you can watch them again and learn more. And one of the great results of the work done by our fellows is that we can applaud all the books that are published by BMRC fellows as a result of their work doing research in BMRC members' archives. So here's just a short selection of some of the books that have been published, and the picture there is an exhibition we put up in the University of Chicago libraries, encouraging people to actually check out the books and learn and make a connection between the BMRC and some of the materials that were available in the library. I want everyone to know that we do have an open call for papers for our 20th anniversary symposium on Black Chicago. That can be found on our website, and we're accepting abstracts up until January 5th, 2026. So we hope to spend next summer really learning and having a great environment of academics and scholars and artists and archivists talking about Black Chicago and celebrating the BMRC's 20th anniversary. And last but not least, we ask that you support the BMRC's initiatives. We use the funds, donations to do things like what? Support fellows who come here for the summer. So you can see directly where your money goes and how your money lives on through the support of Black Chicago history. And just for those who might be interested in our next talk, that will be on November 14th, featuring Cotter, Christian, and Will Fryer, and they will be talking about Calvin Ashford's interior design legacy. So without further ado, I will turn the floor and the screen over to Dr. Martha Patterson.
So thank you, everyone, for coming. And I want to begin by thanking E. James West, my respondent. So again, I'm delighted to be here. I wanted to start today by actually with a list of questions and kind of the to get hopefully people they could respond in the comment section if they have any ideas. So this is the beginning of a long project, book length project on Era Bell Thompson and her work for both Ebony and Beyond Ebony. And here are the questions that I want to start with these and hoping that I can these are kind of initiatives that I'm working on now that I need to follow up on. So I'm hoping to find and interview people who knew Era Bell Thompson. I'm still working on verifying precisely what she published. A lot of her work is unsigned, and while there are drafts, she has a large archive. This is still something that I need to very carefully go through and document. I'm trying to determine the precise role of the CIA and the State Department in shaping Era Bell Thompson's Africa coverage. So one of the things I discovered in her archive is that she was contacted by a CIA representative, but I have not been successful in finding out and getting any precise records about what her role was for the CIA. I'm working on positioning Era Bell Thompson as thoroughly as possible in her friend, family, and professional networks, both in the US and abroad. She was a voluminous correspondent. And tracking that is a challenge, tracking exactly those networks and then following up on those networks and seeing if there are archives with all the people she corresponded with is to get the other side of the correspondence is something that I'm working on. And I'm still hoping to find, I don't know if John Johnson's archive survives. I understand that the photo archive is at but the print archive, I am still hoping that exists. And her work for Ebony, she was a co-managing editor for Ebony Africa, and then trying to position that magazine within African print cultures is another challenge. And then finally, while I was doing this work at the Harsh, I was really fascinated by her, Era Bell Thompson's groundbreaking role in breast cancer awareness for Black women as she documented her own radical mastectomy in the pages of Ebony. So these are all the questions that I'm really hoping that my listeners might have some ideas for me to help. So let me start. In February of 1952, Era Bell Thompson, acclaimed author and the first Black female foreign correspondent and managing editor of the nation's leading African-American photographic magazine, Ebony, had had enough. Having worked tirelessly over lunch hours and during weekends since the fall of 1947, Thompson, now 42 years old, company founder John Johnson was only 28, declared that she was unappreciated, underpaid relative to her male colleagues, and denied bylines when junior male colleagues readily got them. I am the only managing editor who has regular columns in all three publications, Ebony, Negro Digest, and Jet, none for which I receive credit or recognition. After pointing out how critical she had been to Ebony's rapid circulation growth and how careful she had been to follow workplace rules and budgetary constraints, Thompson emphasized the raise and bonus double standard within the company. As the oldest employee, I share titles with and receive only $5 more than Mr. Nipson, who has been here only half as long. I think you should know, Mr. Johnson, that the weakest point in the morale of the office is a feeling that you believe a white man, likely a reference to Ben Burns, founding editor of Negro Digest, Ebony, and Jet, is worth more than a Negro. In an earlier draft of the letter, she threatened to quit. Thompson's ultimatum letter seems to have inspired the notoriously penurious Johnson to co-sponsor Thompson's 18-country tour of Africa. Travel was a foremost concession Thompson sought, And over the years, she would gradually secure more bylines as she survived rounds of Johnson Company firings to become one of the longest serving employees in the Johnson Company. Nevertheless, the importance of her work to the African American literary canon, the development of a Pan-African consciousness, and a major force in popularizing the civil rights movement is only recently beginning to receive widespread recognition. I begin with this anecdote because it reflects Thompson's struggle for recognition, the centrality of travel to Era Bell Thompson's work, and her acute awareness of gender and racial bias, even within Black networks of power. In turn, the erasure of the significance of Thompson's work reflects the lasting effect of E. Franklin Frazier's famous 1955 dismissal of Ebony when he declared it to be promulgating the bourgeois values of the make-believe world of the Black bourgeoisie. Although the excellent recent work of Adam Green, E. James West, Jonathan Fenderson, Flannery Burke, and Aisha K. Hardison recenter Ebony in Black civil rights discourse and in regional studies, Ebony writers, and especially Era Bell Thompson, have yet to enter the Black literary canon. Author of an autobiography, American Daughter, published in 1946, an African travelogue, Africa, Land of My Fathers, published in 1954, regular opinion columnist for Ebony, co-editor of a collection of essays, White on Black, editor of the groundbreaking Africa, Ebony, and foreign correspondent and managing editor for Ebony for almost 40 years, she played a key role in defining Cold War Pan-African consciousness. Although her writing at the time was widely praised, conceived, and marketed as a direct response to Richard Wright's native son, his autobiography, Black Boy and Gold Coast travelogue, Black Power, published in 1954, she is not even mentioned in most studies or anthologies of the period, including the Norton Anthology for African American Literature, Jesse McCarthy's The Blue Period, Black Writing in the Early Cold War, Stephen C. Tracy's Writers of the Black Chicago Renaissance, Darlene Clark Hines, and John McCluskey Jr.'s The Black Chicago Renaissance, nor was her work included in the Chicago Art Institute's 2025 exhibition, Project of a Black Planet, The Art and Culture of Pan-Africa, a rather stunning omission considering Chicago-based Ebony's central role in popularizing a Pan-African consciousness. Part of that erasure was likely due to the apparently light, optimistic tone of her autobiography, American Daughter, which seemed out of step with the urgency of civil rights efforts to combat post-World War II white supremacist violence and segregation. As African American soldiers returned home following World War II, lynchings of Black veterans and other white violence swept the South. Even after the 1948 Shelley versus Kramer case declared racially restrictive covenants legal, Chicago's brutally overcrowded, rodent-infested kitchenettes became, in the words of Imani Morrison, shorthand for the, quote, lethal racial capitalism operating on Chicago's South Side. Era Bell Thompson's work, however, deserves reappraisal, not only because her lyricism about the American prairie rivals that of Willa Cather, and her displacement of Jim Crow trauma reveals a means of Cold War dissemblance, but also because her depictions of domestic and international travel via train, car, and airplane across state, national, and continental boundaries offer a unique window into the fight for Cold War civil rights. Thompson saw travel not only in the words of Cotton Seiler as an expression of her desire and fitness for citizenship, a practice that fused self-determination and self-representation, mobility, consumption, and social encounter, but also as a means of at once testing, exposing, and escaping Cold War Jim Crow, while promoting a guarded ebony model of Black liberalism. In the process, Thompson defines Black Cold War liberalism through the travel test, shifting the South-North map of the Great Migration first from the West to the East, then from the East to the West as a tourist, and finally to the reverse migration back to an African homeland. Using travel and mapping as both theme and metaphor, I argue that Era Bell Thompson's work, and especially her book-length travel writing, is critical to understanding the Chicago Black Renaissance, African American Cold War writing more broadly, and the development of the 1950s Pan-Africa, New Africa, and New Negro consciousness. Ralph Ellison, whose parents migrated to what it was then Oklahoma and Indian Territory, writes, geography is fate. And in moving west, his family sought a land of opportunity. The Thompson family likewise moved west, specifically North Dakota in the late teens, hoping to find as a new home in the wide open spaces where there was freedom and equal opportunity for a man with three sons and a daughter. Historians Taya Miles and Sharon P. Holland argue that by the late 19th century and early 20th century, many African Americans had come to see the Western lands called Indian Territory as a refuge in America, and more as a potential Black space that would function metaphorically and emotionally as a substitute for the longed-for African homeland. Miles and Holland continue the very notion of a visionary politics and African American culture is inextricably tied to an idea, imaginary or realized, of Indian nations and territory as open and even marginal space, a psychic territory where Black subjects find safety, solace, autonomy, and family. Later, after her mother dies and her father and brother become increasingly disillusioned with the relentless backbreaking labor of homesteading, Era Bell, alone among her family members, claims the North Dakota farmland as a site of solace, multi-ethnic fusion, artistic inspiration, and an empowered coming of age. And I'm not going to read this. Here's a map I just wanted to show you. These are a map of her movements. And I've got they're numbered here, but I want to move to this passage. Whoops, this is the passage that I want to move to. I'm not going to read the whole thing. Well, I'll read part of it. Let me read part of it. It's very beautiful. I love the long, solitary ride through the golden autumn sunshine during the brief North Dakota fall when the day stood still and the warm silence was unbearable in the poignant beauty. Sometimes I tied the reins to the seat and ate the shiny coffee-colored flax seeds or scooped them up in my palms and let them run through my fingers like millions of tiny sequins. When I came to the elevator, I carefully drove the load up to the steep ramp onto the scales to be weighed and dumped. The horses needed no urging going home. I talked to them through the twilight above the rumble of the empty wagon. I sang my German songs or recited Little Gottlieb. Having adopted some of the language and custom of her German neighbors as she observes the twilight sunset along the horizon, Thompson revels in a moment of an unbounded West where she communes across culture, race, gender, and even species. By contrast, Thompson describes Chicago, where she lives and works after the death of her father, through the spatial movements she can and cannot make, both alone and with white company. In the note she makes for American Daughter, she compared feeling like a despised minority in Chicago rather than as an individual on the plains. When a white college friend visits her, she writes, I wanted to take her to a nice cafe in the Loop, but there were many places I couldn't go. I was ashamed. Only in Washington Park, on the cool grass and under the pure blue sky, under the whispering trees, no shadow of race would come between us. In North Dakota, she would adopt the pseudonym Dakota Dick, a bad cowboy from the wild and woolly West, and a series of columns for the Chicago Defender, Lights and Shadows section where satiric verse about flappers appeared beside poems by Countee Cullen and Langston Hughes. Thompson writes, I am the foreman of a 9-section ranch owned by Badlands Bill McCarthy. What's more, I've got the handsomest map in the outfit. Can ride 'em scared, dead, dying, or hypnotized. In another column, she says she's been trapping coyotes and hunting buffalo and decides she is a man in body, but a woman at heart, end quote. And yet prior to this playful celebratory Western masquerade and seemingly antithetical to the novel's theme of unity and racial reconciliation, Thompson describes a brutal act of white mob violence so visceral and so directly emblematic of white supremacist claims of public space that I argue it must be displaced. In the chapter entitled Our Land, Thomas vividly recalls her brother Dick sending the family a copy of the Chicago Defender, the first Black newspaper she had ever seen, during the red summer of 1919. And I'm going to post this passage here. I'm going through, there's a, yes, and I want to emphasize the way in which she writes about car travel, the way in which the car is refigured here as a source of terrorism, racial terrorism. On the front page was a large picture of a Negro hanging from a tree, followed an account of a Southern lynching in all of its diabolical horror, of a man being dragged behind a speeding car through the streets of the Negro section, past his own family, of the mutilating of his body, a final death from the rope to the jeers of the mob, of flames licking his nude body, and white men and women cutting off burned black fingers, burned black ears to carry home in gory triumph, souvenirs for their young. The passage is a horrific inverse of vacation travel as democratic freedom, where the automobile, a symbol in 1919 of modernity, affluence, and mobility, and a gathered crowd eager for excitement and souvenirs for their children, now signifies the horrific lengths to which white supremacist mobs will go to demonstrate their control of Black people in public space and on the road. Thompson responds by saying the spectacle lynching is characteristic of a degraded, godless civilization she wants to escape amid the prairie's expansive skyline. She writes, I wanted never to leave my prairies with white clouds of peace and clean blue heavens, for now I knew that beyond the purple hills, prejudice rode hard on the heels of promise and death was its overtaking, and I wondered where it was God. At the end of her largely pre-career autobiography, she survives the Great Depression to find herself able to afford a vacation out west, where she describes the famous, fabulous, fantastic, and frolicking sightseeing destinations of the West Coast, which seemed to have completely overridden the trauma of which she had read in the Chicago Defender from 1919. And yet, I argue, it's a mistake to discount Thompson's work as disengaged from the civil rights protests. And I've cut sections of this, but one of the her kind of damning reviews from Ralph Allison basically said as much, that she was disengaged from this protest. And particularly the fight against the seemingly omnipresent threat of white violence Black people faced during Jim Crow. Just a few pages before the lynching scene, Thompson recalls her brother wringing, quote, the neck of a chicken he found floundering around outside of the coop, its feet frozen. Thompson renders the butchered chicken and the lynching news as the only two moments of terror in her narrative. But while the lynching appears textually forgotten, quote unquote, the gore of the chicken killing causes a lifelong fear of feathers, a fear that reappears in a particularly fraught moment in her 1954 travelogue, Africa, Land of My Fathers. With the scene's proximity, similar imagery of a bloody killing suspended and brought home, a place of purported refuge, the terror of the bloody chicken and the lynching description are inextricably linked, an act of psychological and rhetorical displacement that contain Thompson's safer fear of feathers within the relatively safe confines of a Cold War Black liberal narrative. Thompson's decision in American Daughter to downplay white racial violence in favor of emphasizing a united America seems to have paid off, not only in robust sales, but in a job offer. Seeing Thompson's American Daughter in accord with his post-World War II vision for Johnson Company publications, a vision of Cold War civil rights liberalism where consumer capitalism, epitomized by leisure travel, and civil rights progress went hand in hand, John Johnson offered her a job. Thompson recalled later that the only one suggestion she had, the only one question she had for Johnson was, "Will I travel?" Ebony, in turn, used travel to demonstrate racial integration progress, offer practical Green Book advice, emphasize Black wealth and modernity, especially as air travel gets increasing coverage, and especially for the early 1950s, encourage a Black diasporic consciousness with overseas travel, including Africa, while offering readers of an oasis from Jim Crow. With its emphasis on relaxation near bodies of water, suggesting the break of white supremacist pollution taboos, desegregated vacations become for Ebony the ultimate sign of race relations progress. As E. James West argues, even though the Negro Digest and Ebony advertised themselves as of, by, and for Negroes, Johnson emphasized the value of his magazines as vehicles for interracial understanding, published letters by white readers, and endorsed extensive advertising campaigns in mainstream white periodicals such as the Chicago Tribune and the New York Times. Although such appeals to interracial understanding carried risk, in 1947, Alabama Senator John Sparkman used an Ebony article to demonstrate that President Harry S. Truman's proposed civil rights legislation wasn't needed. They were a critical part of Johnson's effort to assuage government officials that his publication was not a threat. Certainly Johnson, whose Negro Digest had been flagged by the California Committee on Un-American Activities in 1948 as communist initiated and controlled, or so strongly influenced as to be in the Stalinist solar system, was well aware of the risks of appearing to sympathize with leftists, especially because Ebony editor Ben Burns and Ebony writer Richard Wright had at one point become members of the Communist Party. In a July 1953 memo, the American consulate called Mr. Johnson of the Johnson Publishing Company a card-carrying communist since 1932. Johnson himself steadfastly sought to court government approval, going so far as to recruit FBI Chief J. Edgar Hoover in 1945 to write an article for Ebony. Producing a successful Black magazine empire during the Red Scare would mean a careful negotiation of civil rights and anti-communist rhetoric, especially given that some of the most famous Black celebrities in the era Ebony covered had committed themselves to the left. As Mary Dudziak writes, because the U.S. government was keenly conscious of how communist governments used the brutality of Jim Crow in recruitment throughout the developing world, the U.S. government insisted that civil rights discourse fit within, quote, a story of progress, a story of the triumph of good over evil, a story of U.S. moral superiority. As Toyin Falola and Raphael Joku write, armed with nuclear weapons, propaganda apparatuses such as film, radio, and television, espionage, assassinations, bullying, blackmail, recruiting clients and supporters, blackmail on other instruments of coercion and intimidation, the Americans and the Soviets went about recruiting clients and supporters around the world with little or no consideration for the values of freedom, happiness, and peace they often claim to protect. Even as the Red Scare destroyed lives and ruined careers, the Cold War delimited the civil rights discourse, curtailed political activism that questioned American intervention around the world. African independence movements, in turn, were often perceived as communist influence and therefore a threat to the United States. To silence the voices of leftist civil rights opponents, the House Committee on Un-American Activities and the U.S. government's loyalty security program routinely confiscated passports. Paul Robeson's passport was revoked in 1950, which was mentioned in Ebony. W.B. Du Bois's had his passport revoked from 1952 to 1958. If Thompson's pre-Ebony autobiography ends with celebratory cross-country travel and the prospect of a united America, in her African travelogue, sponsored by both Doubleday and Company and the Johnson Publishing Company, the prospect of a united and an independent America, symbolized in part by free travel within countries and across borders, is far more circumspect. Like American Daughter and Africa, Land of My Fathers, Thompson writes in a personal rather than a directly political narrative, where she speaks from direct observation, excuse me, let me go. This is just a little further. Let me just I'm going to move to the slide. In both the process of united and independent Africa, symbolized in part by free travel within countries and across borders, is far more circumspect. Like American Daughter and Africa, Land of My Fathers, Thompson writes a personal rather than directly political narrative where she speaks from direct observations that FBI records reveal were, especially in East Africa, carefully curated and monitored. Like American Daughter, Thompson sees the global West as a site of gender transgression, a place of both beauty and possibility where travel is a test and testament to Black status and freedom. freedom to travel was crucial to that Cold War New Africa, and the FBI, and this is the from the FBI file on Thompson, and the FBI worked assiduously to control Thompson's movements and contacts in Africa. Having attended a meeting of the Chicago Urban League covered by the Communist Du Sable Worker and served as the managing editor of Negro Digest, which the California Committee on Un-American Activities had flagged in 1948 as communist initiated and controlled, or so strongly influenced as to be, again, in the Stalin solar system, the FBI had flagged Thompson as a potential communist, and she was initially refused a visa to enter the British possessions in Africa. On June 16th, John A. Noon, Regional Public Affairs Officer for the United States Information Service, wrote to the American Consul General in Nairobi, Edmund J. Dortz, that if Thompson were not, quote unquote, accorded the proper courtesies, she would more likely write negative articles not in the best interest of the United States. He gave it a 50-50 chance that Thompson would write articles of value and reassured his audience that they found her to be very naive and uninformed of political matters in East Africa. Noon accompanied Thompson on her visits. Dortz reported in June 1953, that Thompson associated with fellow travelers, commie suspects, in an earlier memo, and that the security situation in Kenya was too dangerous to take any chances. The current Mau Mau difficulties had given the Soviets an excellent opportunity to create trouble for early communist penetration. The Kenyan government, fearing she might be sympathetic to Mau Mau rebels, Jet and Ebony had both offered mostly sympathetic coverage, limited her entry to a maximum of 2 days, but the agent urged caution lest Thompson grow suspicious. Here are her travels throughout Africa. So I'm going to leave this here for just a little bit. Thompson began Africa, Land of My Fathers, by staging 1953, the time of her writing, as a liminal moment of Pan-African consciousness and Black pride. In an oral history she gave in 1978, she recalls, on my first trip to Africa in 1953, as a Black American woman journalist, it was taboo for both African and colonial officials. As an editor, 90% of my mail was addressed to a Mr. Thompson. In Ethiopia, a Black journalist did not bother to meet my plane because he thought the magazine editor was a man. Being sent all that distance for a story, I must be white. He got quite a shock when he met me. She acknowledges how she had throughout her life internalized the anti-Black racism of her era that associated Africans with savagery, gullibility, and cannibalism. Congo swamps and voodoo incantations. I grew up believing that Black was bad, that Black was dirty and poor and wrong. Black was Africa. I did not want to be African. Textbooks supplemented by movies, cartoons, and magazine stories made a shambles of my African background. They pictured Africa as a mysterious land full of dense jungle growths and wild animals, of ignorance and danger, a land where white men bartered bright cloth and cheap beads for priceless ivory, gold, and diamonds, where missionaries fought with doctors to bring the light of Christianity to heathens, and where Bush politicians promised their naked constituents a live Englishman in every iron pot. Thompson positions herself as a prodigal daughter, returning to the land of my forefathers after 300 years and among a few million other American Negroes, taking new interest and growing pride in the motherland. To attract readers, she includes key elements of the Ebony formula: film references, American historical metaphors, Black African success stories, Black historical pride, and celebrity sex appeal to make her case for a popularized new Africa of a growing African independence forged by Western educated Black leaders. She begins her travels in Liberia, which she calls Little USA, and emphasizes repeatedly the benefits of U.S. aid and Black progress, race relations, and African development, especially in her hailing of pioneering African-American photojournalist Griff Davis and the work of the International Development Point 4 program, a precursor to USAID. Point 4, according to Thompson, gave Liberia the free port of Monrovia, the finest harbor on the west coast of Africa and the only free port south of the Sahara. Thompson describes Liberian President William Tubman's letters to Black readers as new Negroes who have experienced some awakening in thought, where the Negro race feels some obligation not only toward the people of Liberia, but also all Africa. Part of that awakening would be fulfilled by a stronger feeling of spiritual connection. Thompson travels to Ife, to the purported site of the Garden of Eden, sacred city of the Yorubas. Here indeed was proof of the African cultural past, priceless art fashioned by Black hands many centuries ago. If these were my ancestors, I had reason to be proud. And I just want to, there's a cover of Land of My Fathers. I just wanted to show you this. You have this very, again, a kind of ambivalent portrayal here. This is a promotional photo for her. On the back of this, you could see her perpetuating this kind of stereotype of Africans as cannibals. So there's kind of, this is actually the inscription on the back of the photograph. So they boil Englishmen. And so, and at the same time, you know, she's advertising her series of she's promoting this Pan-African consciousness. And then here's the article, the Ebony article that came out that I'm talking about now. The only feature-length article in Ebony to appear from Thompson's journey through Africa is the Garden of Eden. It comes from this pilgrimage to Ife, but without a byline. The article and its paratext emphasize the merging of British and American expertise, the heavenly descent of Ife's Oni, the city's wealth, artistic treasures now claimed by local museums rather than looted, and in the advertisements that accompany it, the importance of pursuing travel, phenotypically white beauty standards, and celebrity culture. In Lagos, Nigeria, Thompson explicitly defines the New Africa as having bridged the developing and the developed world. Here were the real Africans who had never been away from their motherland, and the new Africans who, educated in the ways of the Western world, were demanding control of their country, were already assuming the responsibilities of leadership. In her chapter, Gold Coast Glamour Boy, Kwame Nkrumah, who had asked Thompson to ghostwrite his autobiography, and, as she later recalled, made a pass at her, epitomized a new Africa because he had been using his American education at Lincoln University in Pennsylvania to help his people. And so here we see a piece she wrote on Nkrumah, and she emphasizes here again this $1 million yacht which Ebony says this was that he had, and is celebrating that. This was Tubman dollar. Yeah, William Tubman's Liberian president. At the same time, however, as a Black woman, Thompson is both excluded from certain activities and strives to guard herself against sexual assault, marking her ability to travel freely and safely a sign of the new Africa. An African guide quietly counts her out of a safari. She is denied access to see one of the 7 wonders of the world, the Great Victoria Falls, along the Zambezi River, because no hotels would accommodate her as a Black person. At several points in the narrative, she hastily retreats from her role as a journalist and bolts her door in fear of sexual assault. Ultimately, I argue, and what I'm going to see is this early part of the book, Thompson's work served to reinforce Cold War liberal American messages of civil rights progress as a means of combating communist influences in Africa. At the same time, as these two books overlay each other, and as they emphasize impediments to travel in the global South, in this new Africa, they disrupt the optimism of the narrative. If the only oasis can be found in the sky, and this is what she repeatedly, we see in her travel log, is that she kind of relaxes when she's flying, but on the ground she's facing all these challenges. In the sky, the threats of sexual assault, right, mob violence, and I would say that, in the sense of white supremacist mob violence within a global South, that threat remains. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Martha. That was great. We will now defer to Dr. West, if you would like to comment or have questions, and we can have a discussion between the two of you about.
Yeah, great. Thanks very much, and thanks, Martha, for your talk. For people on the call, please do, if you do have questions, please drop them in the chat. The easiest way for us to do it is if you have questions, please put them in the chat. I'll read your question out as we go to Martha, and then potentially if you have a follow-up, you can either put it in the chat again or pop your mic on and just follow up with Martha directly. But yeah, I'll get us started with a couple of questions. So the first couple of questions, I guess, are practical ones, and they circle back to some of the like challenges or opportunities that Martha you kind of flagged right at the start of your talk. And I'm sure it would be interesting for people on the call just to kind of know a bit more about this. So one of them is in terms of verifying precisely what Era Bell published. So what are the challenges there specifically? And you mentioned a bit about the bylines and the lack of bylines for Era Bell. Is there also is she publishing almost exclusively in Ebony, or are there other outlets that she's publishing in throughout her career as well? Can you maybe give a bit more insight on that?
Thank you for the question, James. I mean, one of the things that was particularly intriguing when I was at the Harsh Summer was the series of editorials that it appears that she wrote. All right, these would be very important. These are the during the heart of the civil rights movement. It appears that she is the one responsible for Ebony's editorials. I need to verify that, however. They are unsigned. They're in her collection. But I need to one of the things I need to go back is really to make sure that she is, it's not clear to me, I mean, I think that she authored these, but I need to actually verify that she in fact authored these. I don't know if they were collective. Yeah, so that's something. So this is, for example, this is in her collection. I was very intrigued by this. This is a brand new Negro is coming directly from a Martin Luther King speech, where he introduced, he gives the same celebrates the same phrase. So this is something, again, I'm trying to, it's these editorials that really fascinated me, and I want to try to, because I think that would really shift the narrative, shift the narrative of just of how we think of Ebony Magazine and yeah, just as the male-centered nature of how we think about Ebony's, cultural impact.
Yeah, thanks very much. Amy in the chat's got a question. Hi, Amy. Speaking a bit more about the photographers. So this is actually something that I think is a really great area of study for Ebony in terms of the photojournalism, and a bit more of a focus specifically on people like Griff Davis, who you mentioned in your talk. So Amy asks, can you speak to Era Bell's relationship with Ebony's photographers, especially those who documented her trip to Africa?
It's a great question. I can speak to it a little bit, but this would be ideally, I would be following up with the archives of those to see if archives are available of those photographers. Her relationship with Griff Davis, he actually appears as he's written into her narrative, Africa, Land of My Fathers. And so he appears as a character in that narrative, as well as and she's celebrating his work as a kind of new Negro figure, who is doing this, who is representing all the American investment in Liberia. So now at the same time, then she, other photographers are either not, when she's moving, as she's going to different, she's moving throughout the continent, she's using other photographers, and they're not all named, and tracking them down is going to be more difficult. So yeah, so it's a great question. There's more, her archive, there's an extensive photo archive that accompanies her, and the photographer is not always included in that archive. It's often just, these are the people in the picture, but not always the photographer who took the image. So sometimes yes, and sometimes no. So
yeah, Amy, if you've got a follow up to that, please just drop it in the chat. Yeah, I think a lot of us are kind of eagerly looking forward to the Johnson photo archives becoming more available. Some of you might have seen the talk that's happening today as well with the Getty, and I think Raquel and Skylar Hearn and a few other archivists who you may know are involved in that. So yeah, I'm sure there'll be more images there, but then potentially maybe just more questions than answers if they don't have the the identifiers or in terms of who's taking specific photographs. A question from Flannery Burke. So talking about Thompson's descriptions of the threat of sexual assault in American Daughter, very similar to that of one of the descriptions in Land of My Fathers. So who do you think Thompson was addressing in her descriptions of sexual assault?
Interesting. I found it really, I found it very interesting about the about the whole way she dealt with trauma. And I make this case that she's displacing trauma, right? The trauma of Jim Crow. Um, and the, as far as the trauma of the repeated fear of assault, I think this is supposed to, I think generate sympathy, especially for female readers. And some of her most sympathetic reviews come from female critics. Um, and I think that's partly, I think there's an identification there that she's conscious of that. So I would say that would be, that acknowledgement is reminded me a little bit of a tradition in African American writing to make addresses to um, public appeals uh, to especially to women readers, to not perhaps judge me for not getting the kind of narrative that, or the insider narrative that, Richard Wright has in his travel log, right? That she's not going to have access to the same um, uh, power networks, political power networks, because she's female, because she's a woman. So um, I think there's, anyway, I don't know if that answers your question, but I think part of that is what's going on. She's very conscious of being viewed unfavorably in if she's read in conjunction with Richard Wright, being viewed as less, uh, um, or her contribution as being less significant. So I think this is, one way to kind of, I think, generate more empathy from her readers.
Yeah. Um, Please, yeah, keep people on the call. Please do keep your questions coming in. A few questions from me, and it's really around Era Bell's positionality within Johnson Publishing as an institution. And I know that we've talked about this a little bit in other venues before, but it's kind of sometimes a bit of a struggle to exactly pin down where Era Bell fits and her relationship to other editors and also just kind of the broader pulls and pushes of what's happening within JPC. So there's a couple of ways we can think about this. So one aspect of this is her age. So she's actually quite a lot older than quite a few of the other, like John Johnson, I think was born in 1918, Hoyt Fuller's early 20s, Lerone Bennett's like end of the 20s. I think Era Bell was maybe born in 1905 or 1906, something like that.
Yep.
So she's kind of like sneaky old when she's really writing a lot of the Africa focused content in the 50s and to a degree a little bit later on. Do you where do you see her? Or where does she see herself? Do you think she is this kind of like elder statesperson within the company? Is that kind of counteracted by sexism and perceptions of her like um, gender and how that informs her seniority? I mean, can you speak a bit to kind of her age and that relationship and how it informs her place within the company?
Yeah, I think, it's interesting, James, because she's continually self-deprecating, not just about her age, but about her appearance. Uh, and, and in some ways, I think she uses that to be perceived as like, I'm not going to be a threat to, like I'm not, or I'm not going to disrupt the workplace, right? Because I lack sexual appeal. I mean, I think she presents herself in some sense, she's the one that's holding the line. She's the one that's really responsible and, minding the budget. And, I mean, as we in that very first letter, right? I mean, she presents herself as I'm the hard worker who toes the line, and everybody else is kind of taking liberties and doing God knows what on their off hours. So I think that part of this is, uh, I mean, she's kind of keeps coming back to this work ethic, this extraordinary work ethic. I mean, she's working all the time, lunch hours, weekends, all the time. Um, so I don't know if that answers, that doesn't answer your question at all, but the one thing I want to say though, that one of the kind of the most moving things I found in the archive trip this last time was her correspondence with Gwendolyn Brooks, where, she's giving, they're treating like financial advice, how to, investment advice. And I think as she's very much conscious of the fact that she's going to be, she's older. She's got to really think about, especially as her health is failing. Um, and I found that very interesting. And, in terms of creating networks outside of Ebony, um, that are supportive. So anyway, I don't think that really answers your question, but uh, yeah.
No, that's okay. I appreciate it's a bit, it's quite difficult to just kind of
Well,
bluntly
it's like,
say if there's a link.
well, there's more reading. I've got to go through all these letters. I mean, the other thing too is just, as I mean, her archive is so vast and she saves everything. So it's kind of, well, everything and nothing. I mean, this is the other challenge I have is you have some letters that are all cut up, right? So you have all these gaps, right? And so, the other thing that I find so interesting about her, and I think this distinguishes her from her younger colleagues, definitely, is she's aware of herself as she is creating an archive to be written about. And that is interesting because even, looking at Ben Burns, I mean, Ben Burns, well, there's like these gaps. I mean, she's saving everything from the get-go, I mean, she's really seems to see herself. And maybe this is because she wrote her autobiography so early in her career. She seems to be, you know what I mean? She's like imagining herself. She's older and she's actually imagining someone writing about her. She knows that her work is important, in ways that I you could address this, James. You would know better if other writers saw themselves, for Ebony, saw themselves in the same way.
Yeah, I mean, I guess the age question links to another thing which I've always wondered about Era Bell, and I've kind of struggled a bit to pin down myself, which is, her political sensibilities and, writers. So John Fenderson, he's talked about a kind of left-wing bloc within Johnson Publishing, and you know, we can describe, I mean, factions is maybe a bit of a dramatic way to frame it, but there's certainly these different kind of blocks or groups of people within Johnson Publishing who have different political sensibilities. And this is one of the most interesting things about the company, is how these different people with different kind of philosophical, ideological perspectives come together to develop this institution. I mean, for Era Bell, like, how can we get a handle on her politics, like on her political sensibilities? Does she see herself as kind of connected to people like Richard Wright? I mean, that's, the comparison that's kind of there, but in terms, is that more from a writing and experiential perspective more than a kind of political one?
I think she would see herself as far safer. It's interesting. I keep thinking of Jessie Fawcett and in the crisis, and how Era Bell Thompson in some ways kind of has similar challenges, like she's being seen as kind of the prim, there's a little bit of that tension, that she is, um, she's the one who's kind of that takes a safe route. She does write, she thanks Lyndon Johnson. She writes him a thank you note at one point. Um, and so this is partly why I think these editorials are so crucial, to actually, I mean, this is kind of where I want to start with and the next time I get an open window for research is really to, I think ideally, what needs to be done, like these need to be republished as like, once I can establish, definitively that she is the author of these, I think we have a much clearer perspective of her politics. But again, the extent to which she's working with the federal government, she is working with the State Department closely. And so her politics are going to be very much shaped by that relationship. And not, she's afraid of having her passport restricted. She's always saying, I'm not a communist. That appears multiple times, in her work. I do not want to be associated with communism. So I think that there's this kind of, very guarded. She's very cautious during the 50s. Now later, that's, um, I, the State Department contacts continue. That definitely continues throughout into the 60s. So I'd be curious also about how her politics evolve.
Yeah, yeah. I think that kind of idea of proximity to the state is a super important one, and maybe aligned to a bit closer to someone like Simeon Booker within Johnson Publishing and his relationship, based out of, well, for a large part of his career based out of DC. But yeah, he's another one where, yeah, reading Simeon Booker, his memoirs written with his wife before he passed, they're kind of interesting because, yeah, politically, again, a little bit difficult to pin down in some ways. Someone who, yeah, was very happy having government agencies connected to the JPC offices in DC, but then also, was actively involved in documenting the movement in the South, particularly in the early days, and put himself in direct danger quite a few times. But yeah,
Mm.
yes, as you say, a lot more to unpack. I think we've got a little bit of time still, so any questions, please just do drop them in.
So I have a question. Sorry if it's
Yeah.
two questions actually. So the first one is, well, I don't know if this is I'm doing a comment more than a question, but Jennifer Douglas, who's an archival scholar at the University of British Columbia, has written a lot about how personal archives, especially when they're consciously donated during the person's lifetime or even after their lifetime by a family member, how they're kind of curated by the person to present a certain image of themselves. And so she uses, for instance, Sylvia Plath's archives that was donated, and how her mother had a hand in that process. And so I was just wondering, like, I think that she's written a lot about this, and so how people who are then using those archives should think about the conscious effort that is made to present a certain picture of the person, either by themselves or their family or whoever was donating it. So I just wondered if that might come into it, which leads me to my question of, do we find Thompson in other people's materials? I mean, do we get another window into her life that's not based on her own curation? That would be one question I had. And then I also wonder if you're open to, and I'm not promoting, but if you're open to using digital technologies to try to figure out, the similarities between editorials to see, text mining, AI, if you would like to use that, to try to see what a computer thinks about, if the authors are the same and different things. Just throwing that out there.
Those are great questions. First of all, thank you for the reference to Douglas's work. I really appreciate that. So yes, I mean, I think she's definitely curating, and especially her romantic relationships are I mean, that's where we start to see a lot of those letters cut up. We can still, there's still evidence there of that romance, but it's definitely curated. And I'm also conscious about, what is she taking out from colleagues about internal strife within the organization. This is something that I would be curious about, what James thinks about this. There's some of that correspondence that I found, but not a lot. She seems, a lot of the correspondence is very, um, I get the feeling, I'm kind of missing some of the drama, what's of the workplace drama, and I'm curious about what James thinks with his own work. So as far as her appearance on other archives, so I did look at the Ben Burns collection. There's a little bit of reference to her in his collection. Um, I still need to look at the Bennett collection. And again, I'm sure James can address whether or not she appears there. But it's, what I would love to know is if the John Johnson collection exists. Actually his correspondence, what he's writing to her, and what his tone is. How is she being kind of, that's the part of that kind of dynamic that is a little bit challenging to assess. The one thing I just wanted to add, though, another fascinating thing, I know Flannery Burke is on this call, is throughout her life, as she keeps her connection to the West. She is very intent on that, and she's very proud of the work she did in North Dakota, and that really defines her. Her conception of her archive as well. She sees herself, I think, as one of her biggest contributions as being an American daughter from the West. Oh, the text mining, as far as the text mining goes, I would love to know how to do that. I just don't know how to do it. So I, at one point for my book, the book that's coming out, I tried to do that. I tried to work with some scholars from Canada on that. And it was, this was years ago and the technology wasn't fully developed. And so, but yes, that's something I would certainly be open to.
Okay, thank you. And I don't know if you know, there's a comment from Stephen Adams, one of our board member, our head of our board, in the chat as well. If you want to, I think he's sharing a resource.
Oh, okay. I'll have to look.
Yeah, it's something from the Du Bois collection at UMass. I
So,
think it's a Telegram.
from you, okay. Well, and I'll be able to see the chat. Let's see if I can see the
Yeah,
chat.
you should be able to see the chat.
Okay.
But, if you can't, we can just send that on. I can send the link on if you want.
Okay, that would be great. Yeah, I would love to see that. So do you have anything to say about that, James? Can you talk about I'd be really curious about your thoughts about, did you get a sense of the kind of nitty gritty, did you get more of a sense of the nitty gritty, daily, office politics from, your work in Lerone Bennett's archive?
Not so much. Like the most fun thing I think have seen is Hoyt Fuller's papers are at Atlanta University Center. And he, for a short period, well, I'm not sure how long it ran, but there's a couple of editions of what is called JPC IANA, which is his little kind of confidential, quite snarky newsletter that he kind of circulated to his friends within JPC. And there's some commentary on like other people within the company, and some of it's a bit veiled and unveiled. The thing that for people like Fuller, I think the thing about Era Bell that I think they found her quite bougie, to be honest. Because there was the whole thing about like when she went to Africa and she went hunting and stuff. And yeah, that seemed to rub a few people the wrong way. But it's nothing really. You kind of get little glimpses of the way that people think about her, maybe personally. But yeah, it's quite difficult to trace it as a through line, and ultimately the relationship that was the most important probably was the relationship with Johnson. And
Oh, go ahead. Part of what was so interesting, James, is that her monolingualism is really challenging, right? She's making this tour through Africa. She doesn't speak, you know, in many cases, right? She can't speak the language, the colonial language or native language. She is really hampered by that, and so you always have this, like, I think, this insider outsider. She manages because of her Ebony connection to get some really um, key interviews, but at the same time, you always, when you read her travel log, you always have this sense of her outsider status, and I would just be curious, like, how much of that you have, like, in the internal workings of Ebony. I mean, she doesn't strike me as someone. I mean, I know she is close to um she's close to some people, but I just wonder if she's, is because of her age and because of um as an older woman, if she's more, if she's not in on some of those, after work, you know going to the bar kind of, discussions that I assume likely happened.
Hmm. Yeah, I think the monolingualism is a really, really important part of this, and I think it probably um, distinguishes her to a degree from people like Hoyt Fuller, who spent an extended period of time living in Spain and could speak pretty good Spanish, and then someone like Hans Massaquoi, who's German Liberian descent and could speak fluent German. And yeah, I think you're right. I think you're right. Absolutely, that does play into this kind of outsider, this you know role that she kind of plays and to a degree embraces during her travels. And then the kind of internal politics. I think JPC, and this you can see it in her papers, you can see it in other people's papers. It's a very gendered space. It's a very sexist space. There's that wonderful image which I'm sure you're familiar with of I think it's from the 50s when you have Era Bell at the center of what was then the editorial team, and I think she might be the only woman in the shot, and she's completely surrounded by these other men. And I think the kind of
Right.
more formal networks as well as the formal networks do feed into that. So it's is she a part in the company? Perhaps is that an extent a defensive mechanism? Is it intentional? Is it wanted? Is it not wanted? I think these are things that are important to think about for sure.
Yeah, and her size as well. I mean, this is the other thing. I mean, she's very, very conscious of her, she's 4 foot, was it 11 at
Yeah, yeah,
max?
yeah.
And she's very and she's very conscious, writes about her size and and how that, I mean, I think there's always that sense of having to of being dismissed, having to um uh, always kind of work against that shock of, oh, I'm a woman, oh, I'm small. I'm, always having the shock of having, people uh, just underestimating her, or misidentifying her in some way,
Yeah.
or misrecognizing her, you know, just assuming. I mean, writing, I think, is a way, is a way of compensating for that, right? So in some ways, I think her name works to her benefit because it's ambiguous. The gendering of her name is ambiguous. So um, I wonder if that, in some sense, helps her in initial contacts with people.
Mm.
Um,
Yeah. Thanks. I think Sumayya's, so probably going to look to wrap up. I think Martha, if you want to have the last word. I mean, um, how in terms of moving forward, obviously that this is part of a larger book project. I mean, are there any other kind of things that you want to point people towards in terms of your work on Era Bell? Have you got any kind of specific things that you might be working on to keep an eye out for? Or is it mainly, you're kind of still fairly early days with it, thinking about the larger book project?
yeah, I am in the very early stages of this project, and I think that what what I'm excited about now is there's a lot of work coming out on the role of Black women editors And that's something I haven't talked about much. I've talked about her more as a writer and not as an editor. And I think that that is another kind of crucial element of the narrative. I mean, how is she shaping, as an editor, how is she shaping the rest of the magazine and the stories? And I think that's also, the role of writer and editor is another crucial component um, of the narrative within these, both the, you know within Ebony during this Cold War period and beyond, and facing all the pressures from the civil rights movement to be more assertive in the civil rights struggle. And so, seeing, just kind of tracing that work, I think is going to be really important going forward. So thank you very much. I
Yeah.
really appreciate everyone who came and all the questions. And James, can you tell me where John Johnson's archive is? Does that exist? I know we've talked about this before. Does his actually paper archive exist, as far as you know? Is it terms of
You'd have to
correspondence?
you'd have to talk to Linda about that. Like, I'm not aware of it being any corporate archive for John Johnson's work, but yeah.
There are some business records
Mm.
from the Johnson Publication Company that are part of that large treasure trove that we're all waiting to get full access to. I know I was told that. So in addition to the photo archives, there are business records. There is a corporate archive, not as extensive, obviously, as the photos, but they do exist, and they're in the same hands of the same people who have the photographs. And I was told about a plan for them, but obviously things have changed in the last year, so I don't know. I wouldn't be able to speak about, but I know that they're there and that they do. There is an intention, I was told, to have them publicly available at some point.
Thank you. That
Yeah.
helps. Thank you so much.
Yeah.
So I
So
appreciate that.
thank you both so much. We appreciate both of you giving the time and for this great research. And we thank you to everyone who joined us today. As I said, this recording will be available on our YouTube channel probably in a few weeks. And it was great learning from you both today.
And thanks to the BMRC.
Thank you all.